laughing, please mute yourself. Thank you. And I want to welcome Dr. Lori Dengler, who is Emeritus Professor of Geology at Humboldt, at Cal Poly Humboldt, and she's an expert in earthquake and tsunami hazards and hazard mitigation. Since retiring from teaching, she continues to provide scientific advice to the Redwood Coast Tsunami Work Group, engage in earthquake and tsunami outreach projects with California Office of Emergency Services, and writes the Not in My Fault column that appears in Eureka Times Standard most Sundays. They're really fun to read. If you don't get a chance to do that, you should try to get online on the Times Standards because they're great columns. She received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in geophysics from the University of California at Berkeley and taught at the HSU Geology Department from 1978 to 2015. She was a member of the team that developed the U.S. National Tsunami Hazards Program and has participated in 6 international post-tsunami survey teams. She was recognized as HSU Scholar of the Year in 2008, received California's Alquist Medal for earthquake mitigation efforts in 2009, and was recognized with the Frank Press Award from the Seismological Society of America for Public Service in 2017. In 2015, she published a children's book about a tsunami debris boat that connected cities in Japan and California, and has developed a K-12 curriculum based on the tsunami boat. You can visit humboldt.edu/KAMOME. And we're very happy to welcome Lori and turn it over to her this very minute. Thank you for joining us, Lori, once again.
Okay, thank you all. And I am hoping you can see my screen. Can everybody see my screen and hear me?
Yes. Great.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Great. Then we've gotten over the biggest hurdle for me, the lovely technology. So today's talk is really more of a history talk, sort of the history of what happened from the mid-1950s to the present, both in terms of energy power and in terms of our understanding of geologic hazards. It turns out that the window of the era of the power plant spans arguably the really most important time in terms of our understanding of Earth systems. Most of that was not available at the time the plant was being designed. This talk is not about pros and cons of nuclear power. I won't go there. It is not about really the modern day assessment of issues at the plant site. We might get a little bit into that, but I really want to walk through from the post-war era to the day, to today in terms of what happened at Buhner Point. I will also apologize for probably what will be numerous errors in this. It will be interesting to see because I sort of was adding slides up to the very last minute, which is what I often do. If you've heard me give talks before, I always like to start with what I consider the most important take-home message. Namely, when you feel an earthquake, please resist the urge to run outside, freeze where you are. If you do nothing more than freezing where you are, you're in pretty good shape. But if you're capable of dropping down to the ground, and right now I have bad knees, so I'm sitting in my chair, you drop, but even while I'm sitting in my chair, I can still lean over, I can put my arm across the back of my neck, and there's really good reasons for this because there's all kinds of important things that link your brain to the rest of your body that go through the back of your neck. So you want to protect that. If there is a sturdy table or desk nearby, please scoot underneath it, but by nearby, I mean it's no more than 5 feet away. The most likely way to get yourself injured during an earthquake is to move while the ground is shaking. And that's what we want you not to do. If you live in a tsunami zone, and we'll go a little bit into tsunami zones today, but not much.
Yes. Okay.
Can people please mute your screens if you are not me? Thank you. So if you are in a tsunami zone, that shaking is your first and probably your only tsunami warning if it's a really significant tsunami event. Ground shaking that lasts a long time is most likely the very first way you'll get notified that a tsunami could be on its way. So please visit, I'll be sharing the Redwood Coast Tsunami Work Group website at the end of the talk. That's a great place to find out if you're in a tsunami zone or not, or while you're driving around, look for the tsunami hazard zone signs. And then it's really important to stay out of that tsunami zone until it's safe to return. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, please remember those points. Now, when you start dealing with government agencies, and there are a lot when it comes to nuclear energy, there are all kinds of acronyms, and I have a hard time remembering them. So a few of what I'll be talking about today, I've written down here. The Atomic Energy Commission, post World War II, signed into law under Truman to foster the peaceful development of atomic science. It transferred the control of atomic energy from military to civilian oversight, but it was dissolved in 1975 because of perceptions that it was way too closely tied to the nuclear industry. It was replaced in 1975 by the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which continues to function to this day to oversee safety licensing, license renewal, and to manage the storage and disposal of spent fuel. You'll see on some of my slides the megawatt electrical unit, which is a way of just measuring how big a power plant is. 1 million watts of electric capacity. And MWE is a big unit. HBPP is the Humboldt Bay Power Plant, which continues to operate today. We're very thankful for it. There is no nuclear facility anymore, but it continues its fossil fuel operation. The Humboldt Bay Seismic Network, HBSN, was Terra Corporation's regional seismic network. I'll get more to that in a bit. SafeStore is the NRC status that allows a nuclear facility to be safely maintained while in the process of being decommissioned. So Humboldt Bay plant was in SafeStore for a long time. It no longer is because decommissioning is now complete. San Onofre is currently in SafeStore, as are a number of other nuclear plants around the country. And finally, the IFC, the Independent Spent Fuel Storage Installation. And you'll get to see the Humboldt IFC at the end of the talk. So I've always loved history, and I always like to put things into a historic context. And post-World War II, there were certainly lots of concerns and worries about the nuclear age, with good reason. And there was a lot of effort to try to promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And Dwight David Eisenhower gave a famous speech to the UN General Assembly in December of 1953, called his Atoms for Peace speech, where he talked about emphasizing looking for peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and in particular, to provide abundant electrical energy in power-starved areas of the world. As part of this effort, a 3-cent stamp was released. And I don't have one, but I've seen what they look like, called Atoms for Peace. Also, as part of this, the push for nuclear power for electrical generation, but also soon after was Project Plowshare. June 1957, the Atomic Energy Commission Chair Strauss wanted to highlight the peaceful applications, not just of nuclear energy, but of nukes, the bombs, nuclear explosive devices, to create a climate of world opinion that is more favorable to the development of nuclear explosive devices and testing. I actually am intimately familiar with Project Plowshare. I'll just go a little bit down to this side route because my sort of first foray that became actually my PhD thesis. I was an intern at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in 1974 as part of the Project Plowshare project. I was working on the nuclear gas stimulation experiment, which was actually the only one of the Plowshare project ideas that actually made it to the experimental stage. I mean, some of these ideas were incredible, like, let's use a nuke to widen the Panama Canal. Let's reroute a river or two. Now, it turns out that the Soviet Union actually did this in a number of cases. Easy way to build a mountain pass. Let's put a canal in desert zones. The project died in 1977. The big champion of it at Livermore was the person we called Uncle Eddie Teller, the model for Dr. Strangelove himself. He gave the welcoming speech that first summer I was an intern at Livermore. So I've shown a slide of what ended up being my PhD dissertation, which was studying the Rio Blanco gas stimulation experiment, where 3 nuclear devices were buried, detonated simultaneously with the hope of creating fractures that would be continuous and thereby releasing a pathway for the gas to be more easily extracted. This was basically the mother of fracking. It didn't work very well. It turns out the modern hydrofracturing systems are much more effective than using a nuke to do this. And my thesis was largely about why it was such an abysmal failure. No, I never got to set off a nuke myself. So I'm going to be showing you a number of timelines to sort of illustrate this era and walk you through how we kind of got into nuclear energy and where we ended up at Humboldt. So 1954, we have the Atomic Energy Act to allow private companies to use nuclear power for generation. And so it turns out, not surprisingly, the Soviet Union was actually the first to do this. June 1954, the world's first operational nuclear power plant. It was a mighty 5 megawatt electrical graphite moderated reactor. It didn't continue to operate for very long. In the United States, the first sort of pilot project is in California at Balasitos, where a relatively modest 40 megawatt electric boiling water reactor was established primarily to demonstrate the feasibility. It was really never intended to provide power on a long-term basis. It was a joint project of General Electric, Bechtel, and PG&E. And the power plant, you can kind of see it over here on the side, kind of looks like a big silo, was decommissioned in 1963. The first full-scale power plant for commercial operation was actually in Pennsylvania at Shippingport. And it was nearly the same size as the Humboldt plant would become, 60 megawatt electric reactor, decommissioned in 1989. So our big power providers, PG&E and Southern California Edison, were very interested in nuclear power. And there were certainly incentives in the early 50s to sort of get on this boat. So the sorts of things that they were looking at to find a site was, you actually want it remote. You don't want it in the middle of a city, but you want there to be a regional need for power nearby. So we're not going to put it in the middle of a completely uninhabited area. Ample source of cooling power, cooling water. And so this really kind of puts you on the ocean or next to a very large lake. We don't want the land to be too expensive. And if a utility already owns the land, all the better. We need to have adequate space. It needs to be accessible in terms of transportation because fuel rods have to get in and out. We don't want to be driving over tiny dirt roads. And we need reasonable geologic formations to be able to build the darn thing. So it's an added bonus if there's already an existing power plant with the electrical grid infrastructure nearby. Now, note, I did not say anything about environmental impact studies because they weren't required in the 1950s. So why Humboldt? So in 1952, PG&E purchased 147 acres at Buhner Point, King Salmon area, to build a power facility. Prior to this, power in Humboldt Bay area is a real hodgepodge of independent sort of small scale units. And so this was intended to, was purchased for the purpose of building fossil fuel steam generating plants to provide a single regional source of power. So for those of you not familiar for where Humboldt Bay is, you'll look right over here. There we have Eureka just to the north. And here is Humboldt Bay, and right there is the Buhner Point facility. So PG&E develops this site in the 1950s, basically the late 50s. There's a great report that Bechtel put together that I can send you the link to if anyone's really interested in it. It's in Cal Poly Humboldt Library. And I got most of these photos from this report. And if we look at the photograph on the left, you can see what the King Salmon Buhner Point area looked like in 1955 with the arrow at this particular picture. Unit number 1 had just been completed. About a year and a half later, Unit 2 would be completed, and they would provide the power to the Humboldt Bay region for several years before they got an assist. So why add a nuclear unit? Well, it turned out it was, these were fossil fuel facilities, the unit number 1 and unit number 2. And there was some fuel that was coming in from the Tompkins Hill gas lines, but much of the fuel had to be brought in, transported in, and that was expensive. In kind of digging through all of this, I was sort of surprised to learn that really very early on, probably in the by 1955, PG&E was already considering the Humboldt Bay location as a possible place for a nuclear power facility. But at that time, when they added up all the numbers, it just looked like it was too expensive to try to do it in Humboldt Bay. So the PG&E president actually mentioned at the dedication, the opening of unit number 1, that, hey, you know, we're thinking about nuclear. So this is 56. But right now it's kind of on the back burner for here because it looks like it's too expensive. A couple of years later, February 1958, that's the earliest mention I've been able to find that Humboldt Bay is looking like a go again for nuclear power. So this is from February 1958 Humboldt Standard, when the Board of Supervisors and the Chamber of Commerce in Eureka, Humboldt County Board of Supervisors, basically embraced the idea of developing nuclear power at Humboldt Bay. Now it's useful, I'll just sort of take a side, I may have a slide that got sort of out of order here, but Humboldt wasn't the only location in California that PG&E was looking at. There were at least 5 different locations where they were considering for, in addition to Humboldt Bay, for that first plant. Bodega Bay and Point Arena were pretty well developed plans. And my sense from kind of reading through the records is that Bodega Bay was actually the sort of first choice, but Bodega Bay and Point Arena had sort of 2 strikes against them from the very beginning. They were essentially on a very well-known fault, namely the San Andreas Fault. And even though very creative engineers proposed a way that somehow the facility could accommodate 20 feet of rupture in an earthquake, that didn't go over very well. And in particular, residents of the region were, took to the streets very quickly. And actually a good friend of mine in grad school, that was how she became interested in geology. Doris Sloan, she was one of the early organizers of the Bodega Bay protests. Point Arena had similar issues. So Humboldt Bay sort of, in part by default, became the preferred first foray into nuclear energy for PG&E. It's important to understand what the state of science was in 1958, when they're really beginning to look closely at this site in terms of the seismic, in terms of what kinds of hazards are there. Most of the modern hazard assessment tools that we use today did not exist. The first US seismic hazard map is not released until 1976. The first global seismic network, in other words, seismic stations that are all linked together to give you a global picture of seismicity, that doesn't start until 1960. That's also triggered by the nuclear age, in this case, by the underground nuclear test, the atmospheric test ban that mandated nuclear testing go underground. So suddenly in 1960, seismology was flush with support from the Defense Department to understand how to distinguish between an earthquake and an underground nuclear explosion. And I was somewhat involved with that in my undergraduate days. So that's not, I mean, that's still 2 years away that we're going to actually get a picture of global seismicity. Paleoseismology, which today is really one of the most important tools of determining the seismic hazard of a region, because, you know, we can't just look at stuff from the last 150 years. We've got to be able to look at earthquakes thousands of years ago. That doesn't happen until the 1970s. CEQA, the California requirement for environmental impact studies, that doesn't happen until 1970. Recognition of surface fault rupture. In other words, the idea, I mean, they knew about it a little bit when they studied Bodega Bay plant and wanted to put it on the trace of the San Andreas Fault. But there was not a universal sort of understanding that surface fault rupture is a problem until 1971. And we never hear about tsunamis. So especially tsunamis that might be coming from right here and not from far away. And perhaps most importantly, we don't know anything about plate tectonics. It's still 4 years away, 4 or 5 years that we get the very first papers that talk about the Earth system and where we tend to get the really big earthquakes and what kinds of earthquakes we have in different parts of the world. I managed to find a couple of seismicity maps from the Berkeley seismology lab. We're looking here at earthquakes between 1940 and 1949, and then the next decade next to it. So this is kind of the data that the planners would have had about earthquake hazards. And you can see that there are lots of dots in the San Francisco Bay Area. And at first glance, you kind of go, whoa, looks like the Bay Area has more earthquakes than we do. Well, that was partly because we only had 2 seismic stations operating in this period, and really only one that was decent. It was the one sitting in Founders Hall, the Arcata station. There was another station in Ferndale at the time, which is still operating. The Arcata one, unfortunately, the instrument that displays it broke down, so it's no longer operating. But the old smoked drum recorder you can see at the Ferndale Museum, that's, 1906 technology. And neither of those stations in the late 50s would have been adequate to sort of detect the whole pattern of earthquakes in this area. They were certainly aware of damaging earthquakes. In 1906, the so-called San Francisco earthquake, I prefer to call it the Great Northern San Andreas earthquake because it ruptured all the way up to Cape Mendocino. We had a number of strong local earthquakes. This is just a few of them: 1923, 1927, 1932, 1954, all of which caused quite a bit of damage in Humboldt County. But none of these were really sited close to the power plant. So this is a little graph I put together a number of years ago, looking at North Coast earthquakes in terms of how strongly they shook. Basically the potential to do damage. Intensity, these are not magnitudes, these are intensities. And by the time you get to an intensity 6, you've got some, a fair number of items being knocked from shelves close to the epicenter. By the time you get up to a magnitude 8, we're talking about major damage. And I'd argue the 2 earthquakes in historic times that have really produced strong ground shaking were 1906 that ruptured all the way up to Cape Mendocino, and then 1992 that was located again in the vicinity of the Triple Junction. But in this whole record, we really saw no strong earthquakes near Buhner Point, and there were no map faults within the sort of vicinity of the footprint of the power plant. So let's look a little bit at the construction of Humboldt Unit number 3. Pretty much all of this I've pulled from that wonderful Bechtel report. So the dedication, the groundbreaking is in 1961. And I love this picture with the many of the Humboldt Board of Supervisors standing there to see the first cement bucket poured. And in case you don't have a clue, like I certainly never had, of what does a reactor vessel look like, well, this is what the Humboldt Bay, what would become Unit number 3, the vessel looked like. And it gets sunk way down into the ground. I mean, this is all, the reactor chamber is entirely below the ground. It is dedicated, it goes into operation in 1963. So from 1963 to 1976, it's important to realize that almost all of our power was being generated by Unit number 3. The only time that it was not being generated was when the plant was closed for refueling. So we really had a pretty long period, 13 years, where nuclear power is what is keeping the lights on in Humboldt County. Things are going to change a whole lot during the 60s and the 70s. Most importantly, I'd argue that beginning at about 63, going up until 1970, we have all the real foundation papers for plate tectonics. That by the end of that decade, pretty much all geosciences are on board with this global Earth system, that heat deep within the Earth is driving a kind of complex convection pattern that moves continental material around on the surface, breaks continental masses, creates oceans, and then recycles some of this material back down into the Earth, this complicated, incredible system. This is probably what hooked me on Earth sciences. So when I started at Berkeley in 1964, I was a humanities field major, had no interest whatsoever in the sciences. And then I took an introductory geology course in 65, where that particular professor was really into these new ideas. And it was so exciting. And so I very quickly said, okay, I'll try taking a calculus course and a chemistry course and see if I can survive those. And I did, and the rest is sort of history. So it was really, really exciting to be in Berkeley at that time when they were still debating whether or not this plate tectonic system worked. So in particular, once you have this picture of plate tectonics, you recognize where the largest earthquakes are occurring, and they're occurring on subduction zones. And by about 1968, the sort of first magnetic anomaly map off the Pacific Northwest is published. And it shows very clearly that the region from Cape Mendocino up to Vancouver Island, Canada, is a subduction zone. At that point, it doesn't have a name, it's nameless. And we really don't know much about its earthquake potential. In fact, there's going to be debate as to whether it's even capable of producing big earthquakes. But it is identified. Okay, so there is a lot on this slide, and I'll try to walk through it, and then we'll look at some of this stuff in more detail. But I do first want to note up on the top, I found it's hard to cram everything, to cram a timeline into a PowerPoint slide. But up in red, I've noted this period of the middle to late 70s as the pioneering paleoseismology publications. Like plate tectonics, paleoseismology is adopted very quickly, with Carrie C's very early work on the San Andreas Fault by taking a backhoe out into the field and digging it across a fault and then dating offset units. Hey, we no longer have to rely just on our 150 years of historic earthquake records. We can go back thousands of years. And certainly by the late 70s, people are applying paleoseismology in many, many different settings. But there are other events that are equally important to the fate of the Humboldt Bay Unit number 3. February 9th, 1971 is the magnitude 6.6 Silmar or San Fernando Valley earthquake. I'll get into that in a little more detail because it really changes the landscape in many ways. We have a much smaller, it's actually a 5.3 earthquake in Fortuna. I didn't manage to correct this slide, but a modest earthquake in Fortuna. It's going to be important because it does produce some ground fracturing, but it's the closest moderately large earthquake to the Humboldt Bay power plant site. We're going to find faults are discovered closer to the power plant. Post San Fernando earthquake, there's a lot of concern about surface fault rupture. 1974, we get our first regional seismic network in the area. And then we start getting a little resistance on the North Coast to the nuclear world. So really up until the mid 70s, there have been some localized complaints. In fact, there's a whole book that was published by an engineer at the power plant about some of the problems, operational problems. I'm not going to get into that. That's not my area of expertise. But there's really not much squawking. There's far more squawking about the big pulp mill effluent that you could smell wafting into Eureka much of the time than there was about the nuclear power plant. But that really changes in the mid to late 70s, partly because now we've got some information. And obviously, March 28th, 1979, 3 Mile Island changes the landscape forever. Now, I've highlighted down here that in July of 1976, unit number 3 is shut down. It shut down for routine maintenance because you've got to refuel it periodically. I think 3 years is about the amount of time a set of fuel rods lasts. So it was shut down for refueling, for maintenance. It never reopens. So why was the Silmar earthquake important for the Humboldt Bay nuclear power plant? The slide over here on the left is mapped surface rupture from the San Fernando earthquake. There were miles of places where you could actually go out on the ground, and even if you're not an expert, you could see that the fault had ruptured all the way up to the surface. Relatively few earthquakes rupture to the surface. Earthquake ruptures are occurring typically somewhere between in California, between 5 and 10 miles beneath the surface. Some are a little deeper. And the rupture starts and stops at depth. But once you get into earthquakes in the upper 6 to 7 range on land, and if they're shallow, we have this potential for the rupture to go all the way up to the surface. And surface rupture is a very different hazard than ground shaking hazard. You can have a deep rupture that produces strong ground shaking. That's a very different engineering problem, to build a structure to withstand the shaking than to build a structure to be able to withstand one side moving 5 feet relative to the other. So the house over on the right is an illustration of what happens to a relatively resilient structure. This building, had it not been on top of the fault, they would have felt the shaking strongly, and they would have items knocked from shelves, but the house itself would have most likely been fine. But in this case, the deformation caused by the ground slipping has caused significant damage. And it's a whole lot harder to keep a building together when it has to withstand slip displacement. In this same earthquake, there were over 40 deaths when a hospital, the Veterans Hospital, that was also on a site of surface fault rupture, part of it collapsed. So as a result of 1971, suddenly all regulatory agencies are interested not just in shaking hazards. We're talking about surface fault ruptures. So California passes the Alquist-Priolo Special Studies Zone Act in 1973 that mandates going out and defining little rectangles around faults that are likely to rupture in the future, and an active fault. And typically 10,000 years is given as the base number for what is an active fault. Obviously, you couldn't have done that before paleoseismology. So this is sort of happening at the same time as in the beginning, because paleoseismology doesn't really come along until this has been implemented. So initially, it's really looking for faults that we know have ruptured in historic times. But certainly by the end of the decade, paleoseismology has been pulled into this. And it's not just California that gets interested. The Atomic Energy Commission also gets concerned and mandates that all nuclear power plants assess fault rupture hazards. This is where we get our first regional seismic network. We can thank the Humboldt Bay Power Plant for the fact that we finally get some seismic stations up here, in addition to the one in the basement of Founders Hall. So at this point, I think Bob McPherson told me that Hugo Benioff, a really famous seismologist, suggested to the Atomic Energy Commission or to the PG&E folks that they talk to, not to the Berkeley folks, but they talk to University of Washington. And University of Washington, in coordination with Terra Corporation, establishes the first regional network. And down here, you can see a very young Bob McPherson over there on the extreme left, along with some of the UW folks that worked on the network. Up above that, you can see here's a map of the seismic stations that were put in. Originally, they tried just putting in some stations very near the power plant, but it was very clear in order to understand earthquake hazards, they needed to have a regional network. So from 1974 to 1986, we have a really good regional network. It's actually a denser network than we had up until only a few years ago, when earthquake early warning funding started putting more stations back up here. And here is the cover of the very first report issued in 1974 on the regional seismicity. And by that time, we've actually identified a number of faults. So the faults that are shown on this 1974 map would not have been available to the folks planning the power plant back in the late 1950s. This network provides not just information about the power plant, but really gives us our first good glimpse of regional seismicity. And I show two plots here that Bob McPherson provided and actually became part of his master's thesis. I was his advisor in the early 80s. And the top diagram here shows all of the tiny earthquakes that this network, most of these are 2s and 3s, none of which could be recognized prior to this network. And boom, all of a sudden we're seeing, yeah, there's a lot of earthquakes in the vicinity of the triple junction. But not only do we see this dense cloud, but when we do a cross section, so this figure down below is taking all of the earthquakes in this band that's shaded here. And if we plot them versus depth, you can see how we get this real interesting feature of the earthquakes following a dipping plane to the east. And in fact, we're imaging what we will call the Cascadia subduction zone interface. We're not calling it that yet at this time, but the subduction zone interface is actually the gap between the shallower earthquakes and the deeper earthquakes. The majority of our earthquakes are actually coming from deep below the subduction zone interface, and that continues to this day. So in 75, we have this magnitude 7.5 earthquake down here. And it's about 5-6 miles away from the Humboldt Bay power plant site. This sort of increases the concern, certainly on the point of both people in the area, and now it's the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that we need to really start looking at the surface fault hazard potential and also the peak shaking hazard potential at the power plant site. And about a year later, you can see this sort of aqua balloon. A Forest Service geologist, Tom Collins, discovered a series of offsets in a gravel quarry only about a mile and a half southeast of the power plant. And this really raises alarm bells. For one thing, if you see offset in old hard rock, that could have happened millions of years ago. So it's not a potential problem. But when you see offset in a gravel quarry, that had to be fairly recent. And Tom Collins was concerned enough that he actually wrote up his findings and submitted his report to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in January of 1976. Now, everything submitted to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a matter of public record. And guess who's paying attention to nuclear stuff? Ralph Nader. So he sees this report and he publicizes it. And so what happens is the power plant gets shut down for routine maintenance. And NRC says, hey, you got to look at the potential for strong motions and the potential for surface rupture. So there are kind of two really interesting offshoots of this. One, Tom Collins is not just by himself. There's this wonderful community of geologists in Humboldt County at this time. There's also the beginnings of a kind of nuclear energy concerned group. And so Tom Collins, along with a faculty member, Adam Honea at Humboldt, Wesley Chesbrough, who was a very new politico on the scene, but they needed a politician to be part of this. Fred Cranston, who was in the physics department. I have not been able to figure out who Dimitrios Mitsanis was. Maybe someone out there knows who he was. Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, came together to officially propose themselves as interveners. Intervention was a process the NRC created for members of the public and organizations to basically plea or put in a suit to stop the operation of nuclear facility. As far as I can tell, there's never been in the United States a successful intervention where the interveners alone, without, in the absence of everything else, actually resulted in the permanent closure of a power plant. But it turns out that these interveners had more than just the local evidence on their hands, and we'll get into that in a moment too. But it's important that in May 1978, the NRC officially accepted their plea to be interveners and required that PG&E address their concerns. Now, I had thought, oh, this all came out of the Redwood Alliance. No, the Redwood Alliance is later. And it's this intervention process that actually leads to the Redwood Alliance. So the NRC is concerned about the earthquake hazards. And they are listening to the interveners. So in August of 1977, NRC says PG&E wants to restart the plant. It's all reloaded. They think they've done some seismic retrofits to the plant. They're all ready to put it back online. But the NRC says, no, you can't restart unit number 3 until you have adequately addressed the surface fault rupture hazard and the peak seismic acceleration issues. So in October 1977, PG&E contracts with a big consulting company, Woodward Clyde Consultants, to assess whether or not it's possible to resolve these issues. Now, if you look at the title of their summary report, which was in October of 1980, this is in many libraries. You can certainly get a hold of it at Cal Poly Humboldt Library. I don't believe it's ever been scanned. Evaluation of the potential for resolving the geologic and seismic issues at Humboldt Bay Power Plant number 3. Note, they are not resolving the issues. They are answering the question if they're able to resolve them. Basically, they're saying the conclusion is, yes, we can resolve them. You're going to need to pay us more money. We're going to need to do a bigger study, but it's resolvable. And I've just included one of the figures from this report that I just snapped on my phone this morning. And there's some interesting things about it. It shows our modern assessment of the plate tectonics. And it shows this kind of dashed line, which many of you who've heard my talks before would go, oh, that's the Cascadia subduction zone. It's actually not. Because in 1980, we don't know, we aren't using the name Cascadia subduction zone. At this point, all it is the base of the continental shelf, which turns out to correspond to where we think the Cascadia subduction zone is, roughly. But at this time, it's not, we don't talk a whole lot about it in 1980. So, but the Woodward-Clyde studies turn out to be incredibly important in terms of funding paleoseismology field studies. Many Humboldt geology students were involved in those studies. They also did potential earthquake scenarios. One thing they don't do at all is tsunamis, because in 1980, we're not paying any attention to tsunamis. So this is a fault map that PG&E folks provided me that show some of the faults that were identified as a result of those Woodward-Clyde studies. So you can see this dashed line, Little Salmon Fault. This is the Bay Entrance Fault. And then there are actually a number of faults that were identified right at the site. HBGS is actually the current generating system. So that right here is where our current power facility, the modern one, is located. What really changes everything, and probably is why PG&E never opted to pay Woodward-Clyde more money to really resolve the issues of surface fault rupture and ground shaking at the Humboldt plant, is 3 Mile Island. So March 28th, 1979, we have the most major nuclear accident in the US that involves probably related to human error and a number of other issues. And it released a significant amount of radiation, and it really gave the nuclear energy industry a black mark. And as a result of that, the standards, NRC imposed far more stringent standards on the operation of plants, and the little Humboldt plant was just way too small to consider. So, all right, I don't know what is happened there. Suddenly something popped onto my screen. All right.
That was my fault. My apologies.
Oh, can you remove it, please? Because it keeps popping up on my screen and I can't see my slide. Hopefully now it's gone.
Should be gone, yeah.
All right. All right. So let's move into the next decade. In fact, the next 3-4 decades from 1980 to the present. So in 1983, PG&E submits their formal petition to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to say, okay, we are not going to reopen unit number 3. Now, it's important to realize that between the interveners being recognized up until 1983, there is this enormous volume going back and forth between the interveners and PG&E and the NRC about resolving the seismic safety issues. And the interveners come right out and accuse PG&E of dragging their feet, saying, look, you know, the writing's on the wall. If you want to spend hours, most of these documents you can actually pull up the PDFs they're on. I mean, the one thing about the NRC is that pretty much anything that's ever been written to them is in the public arena. So there are also a couple of other things. Again, everything's happening in context. So in 1980, we have a 7.2 earthquake. We have another 7.2 earthquake in 1992. In 2004, we have the Indian Ocean tsunami. So those are sort of things happening that are going to have influence over what's going on. It turns out you can't just turn off a switch at a nuclear power plant and say, okay, let's just haul everything away and be done with it. If you've been following issues in Ukraine, you get a little bit of the feeling of you can remove fuel rods or move them farther apart. You can slow down the reactions. You can't stop the reactions. Once the reactions have started in a rod, you continue to have a whole bunch of things going on. I remember many years ago when I first learned about the Humboldt Bay plant, probably would have been in '78 when I first came up here. And I thought it so odd that it was allowable to move fresh rods on the highways in trucks, but you couldn't remove the used rods out, because I thought, oh, a fresh rod is probably more dangerous than a used rod. No, because the fresh rod is basically not doing anything. I mean, it's emitting, it has uranium in it, and it has some stuff going on, but it hasn't come to the point of fission. Whereas the used rods have been fissioning for a couple of years, and all sorts of things have changed within the rods. And so the first thing that happens in the decommissioning process is you let everything sit for a decade, because it turns out you get rid of a whole lot of stuff. The daughter products, the amount of high-level radioactive waste after 10 years is a lot less to deal with than it was the day you decided to decommission. The first thing that was done, though, in 1984, they finally removed those fuel rods that had been sitting there since 1976. But then basically it's sitting. And at this point, PG&E then starts petitioning PG&E starts petitioning the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to begin, first to go into a safe store condition. Safe store is actually not an acronym. I mean, it means safely storing high-level radioactive materials on site, because during that first decade, we need to maintain the security of the site. We need to maintain the cooling ponds. We need to keep it in a safe condition. And hence that's what safe store is called. And that's the condition that San Onofre is currently in, is the safe store condition. At this point in the early 2000, well, late, from the point of getting that safe store license, PG&E is now working very hard to develop the ISFI facility, the Independent Spent Fuel Storage Installation, where this high-level radioactive waste can be safely stored for hundreds or perhaps thousands of years. They were able to cart out lower level radioactive waste. There are a number of waste repositories in the country for low-level wastes. And we generate lots of that. For example, medical wastes and so forth. They don't have to stay in the hospital. They can be carted out. So the lower level stuff was carted out, but the high level stuff could not be removed because this continues to be the Achilles heel of the nuclear industry. We do not have an agreed upon methodology for the storage or a place for the storage of high level wastes. So in 2005, NRC grants PG&E's sort of IFC petition. And from 2005 to 2008, PG&E and consultants are working very hard on this issue of how to safely store the rods, where to store them. And the sort of most usual process in the US is this dry cask storage. Let's see, do I have, is this not going to, let me just quickly go to the next. Suddenly my screen is frozen. Let me see if I can. All right, this is what I wanted to show. This is a typical dry cask storage little map. So you make this large cask, which is large compared to a person, but not too big that it couldn't fit on the back of a very large truck if eventually it could be moved. And it has all kinds of layers of containment in it. And you put the spent fuel rods, you put the all of the contaminated parts from the facility, including soil, into these tanks. And you create these underground facilities where they're suspended and they sit there. And if you zoom in to Google Earth, like I did this morning, you can easily see the 6 tanks, storage facilities on the Buhner Point site. They are currently sitting at about 40 feet above sea level. One of the big concerns at the Buhner Point site, which wouldn't have been a concern 30 years ago, but is today, is tsunami hazard. And I borrowed this figure directly from PG&E folks that kind of summarizes their studies of the tsunami hazard at the PG&E site. They ran a whole number of studies, including what are called deterministic studies, where you just sort of put in an arbitrary tsunami source and you look at how big it would be. And you look at paleo tsunami data and you look at examples from other areas. And I realize this is complicated, but this black line is actually the elevation of Buhner Point right here, this black line. And this red line is the California state tsunami hazard for about a 2,500 year return tsunami. So it's just under 30 feet. The storage site, the bottom of it is at 33 feet, the top of it is 44 feet. So right now, it's looking pretty good. Of course, there are issues of sea level rise, and there's also the issues that these storage facilities actually aren't designed to last for 10,000 years. They're designed to last for 50 years with the hope that they'll last for 100 years, and they're under constant monitoring. So this story is definitely not over. So in November of 2021, NRC revokes the Unit Number 3 operating license and decommissioning is complete. But obviously, the story will continue. So a couple of slides to kind of wrap up here, and then I will have some time to answer questions. The photo on the left shows the plant in 2008. At this time, you can still see the, these are the units 1 and 2. And there's not much to see from the nuclear facility. It's just basically the stack had already been removed in 2008, but it was right over here. And here's what it looks like today. And over here, you can see the storage facilities. Units 1 and 2 are gone, units 3 are gone. It's now a big parking area and grass area. And here is the current fossil fuel generating plant. So here is an overhead view of what it looks like today. So again, right here is the storage site. Here is the modern generating plant. This would have been the footprint of the previous plants. And I've also included over here Buhner Point, and the folks in green are the folks from King Salmon who felt the earthquake and grabbed their grab and go kits and have hiked up to the tsunami evacuation site, which turns out to be the highest point. I think it's about 46 feet there, overlooking both the power plant facility and Humboldt Bay. And it's definitely the place to go if you happen to be in King Salmon and you feel a long duration earthquake. So big lessons. Pictures here now down below. I've shown seismicity January 74 to November 2021. And we can't even really see King Salmon on this, but that arrow points to where the power plant was located. And on the right shows just a few of the faults that have been identified since the site was originally planned. I always like to quote the famous sage Donald Rumsfeld, but there are unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know, we don't know. And this whole saga of the Humboldt Bay plant really illustrates the problems of the ones we don't know. In the 1950s, the folks designing the plant, I'm not going to accuse them of having evil intent. I think there really was the hope that this was going to be the great solution to energy problems. And although they were certainly aware of the waste problem, they had the confidence that somehow technology would figure that one out before they really had to deal with it. But they certainly didn't know about subduction zones. And they didn't realize that the site they had chosen, there weren't just these little faults at the surface. The Cascadia subduction interface is about 8 miles beneath the plant site, maybe 7 miles. This is the only fault in the coterminous United States believed capable of producing a magnitude 9 earthquake. And they managed to plunk a nuclear facility right atop it. And so it's always a problem to estimate what you don't know when you don't know it. And that is one of the reasons that so many resources have been poured into understanding the tectonics of the Humboldt Bay region. If the power plant had not been built there, we certainly would know far less about it. So I just began to pull together the folks who contributed to this. Bob McPherson, he helped establish the Terra Network. He introduced me to North Coast tectonics when I first came. He was my very first master's student who knew more than I did. He used the Humboldt Bay Network as his master's thesis. Big thanks to Jeff Bachhuber at PG&E, who is the sort of chief seismologist now for PG&E in 1985. Prior to 1985, PG&E did not have a seismic division. It was just not something they really thought about. And I think in part it was the experience at Humboldt Bay working with Woodward Clyde that they then hired the head of Woodward Clyde, Lloyd Clough, to head their geohazards division. So I think we had something to do with that as well. But I really want to thank Jeff and PG&E colleagues. His predecessor, Stu Nishenko, was certainly also a great person to work with. Peggy Helwig at Berkeley. Obviously, many colleagues at Humboldt, but I can't let a talk go without thanking Gary Carver and Bud Burke, who really were the groundbreaking wave of paleoseismology in Humboldt County. So I do want to remind everyone that this coming October, on October 20th, is the Shakeout Day. And not only is it a good time to talk about earthquake hazards, it's a great time to consider how shaking might tell you a tsunami is coming. I really encourage people to visit our Shakeout page. If you go to the Redwood Coast Tsunami Workgroup page, it'll take you directly. We have a nice little QR code that will take you directly to the Shakeout registration and hopefully convince you of why it's really useful to register. Also visit our Camo May page. And I am now open for questions.
So looking through the chat, I saw that Dorothy had a question of if you can provide links to the maps of the faults and the seismic stations.
Certainly for the present day stations, I can, if she'll just put her, email contact in the chat, I'll be glad to send that to her because I don't want to spend time right now pulling that up. But you can find those, the maps I showed you, those stations are now gone. They were all taken down in 1986. I can certainly provide you with a map of the present day network of seismic stations. Berkeley's seismology lab also has links to that. And then this whole presentation will be available on the OLLI site that you can go back and look at the slides more carefully, is my understanding, correct? Probably in a week or two.
Yes, probably in a few days, actually.
Oh, great, great.
Any other questions on the chat or otherwise? Does anybody?
We have another one from Jim Gable. Does Lori have any data about the erosion of Bun Point over the years?
It's interesting. I don't have it directly. There's certainly people who have looked at Buhner Point is really an anomaly. If you look at it, it sticks up. It has a very sharp edge on the south, sort of a scarp. It's clearly a fault scarp. I mean, it's been pushed up. And when you look at the more detailed, I mean, there's no reason you should have a high point there unless there's something that's been pushing it up. And I don't have detailed stuff on the erosion, but there's certainly been erosion along that face. And I'll try to look in and see if I can find some data on that for you. PG&E folks may well have that. Good question.
Elliot, you have a question?
Yes. I had always thought that the San Andreas fault is a transform fault or a strike slip fault, and you kept referring to it as a subduction zone. Do these play together, or is it one or the other?
Wait. The San Andreas fault system is a transform horizontally moving system.
Right.
It ends at Cape Mendocino.
Oh.
So, okay. And thank you for asking this question, because I don't want there to be any confusion.
Right.
At the time the plant was being planned, people really didn't know how far north the San Andreas fault went. They were aware of very similar earthquakes occurring north of Vancouver Island on what we now call the Queen Charlotte Fault. Mm-hmm. In the 1940s, some really big earthquakes, very much like 1906, are happening. And a decade after they're thinking about the plant, several seismologists at Berkeley publish a paper saying the San Andreas Fault is breaking through the North Coast. That actually, when you looked at the earthquakes that were happening offshore of Humboldt, at first glance, they looked a lot. They had the same kind of motion as the San Andreas Fault. So even as late as 1968, people were saying it's just really all the San Andreas Fault that's happening here. It's not until the Terra network and all of the sort of studies, the paleoseismic studies, where they realized that the San Andreas stops. It's done at Cape Mendocino. That's one of the reasons we have so much compression. And if you haven't seen, if you weren't here for my talk this summer about the Mendocino Triple Junction, you can easily view it in the OLLI archives about why things are pushing so much there. But no, it turned out those brilliant Berkeley seismologists completely misinterpreted what they were seeing. They thought they were seeing San Andreas earthquakes, and it turns out the earthquakes were the opposite, were headed in a completely different direction because of the compression of the Gorda Plate. But the subduction zone itself, it really, I mean, people are sort of aware of it, but they're not aware of the seismic hazards of it until the 1990s. I mean, 1989 is the very first, I couldn't squeeze all this into my talk or onto my slides. Our first paleo-tsunami paper is 1989. And it's not until it's really after our Cape Mendocino earthquake that it's a 7.2 that produces a small tsunami that suddenly everybody's concerned about a Cascadia tsunami. So compressional tectonics north of Cape Mendocino, primarily horizontal strike slip type earthquakes south of Cape Mendocino, which is one of the reasons, and I don't know if anyone read my last column or column before last, where I talk about Diablo Canyon. PG&E was a lot luckier in their placement of Diablo Canyon than they were with Humboldt, because they were aware of the San Andreas Fault, and the site turns out not to be on top of any faults. It was designed for very strong ground shaking. It was also designed 10 years after Humboldt Bay, where they had actually learned some things. So, and it doesn't have the tsunami hazard that we have. So for a number of reasons, the Diablo Canyon plant, the horizontal strike slip faults that are both offshore and onshore of Diablo Canyon don't produce the same surface fault rupture that certainly the Cascadia subduction zone does here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You have a question about what is the difference between magnitude and intensity?
Oh, I always like it when people ask me that. Think of the wattage of a light bulb. Okay, 300-watt light bulb is going to be a 300-watt light bulb, whether it's on my desk right here or if it's in Eureka. If I turn it on, if it's right next to me on my desk, it's going to be very bright. I have intense light. But if you turn it on in Eureka, I won't see it at all. Intensity is the measure of relative strength, of shaking strength. So you're always going to get the strongest shaking closer to where the fault rupture is. And if it's a small earthquake, it's almost like a bullseye that goes around the rupture. If it's a big earthquake like 1906 that was 250 miles long, it's a very oblong pattern along that rupture. But intensity is much more important when you're building structures than magnitude. Obviously, the larger the magnitude of the earthquake, the greater the potential for strong ground shaking. But local geology, distance, the type of faulting, all of those things really factor into intensity, whereas magnitude is just the wattage of that light bulb.
That's cool. Okay, how do you determine the safety of tsunami evacuation zones right along the coast, for example, in Manila?
Okay, what you do is you use as many different methods to assess what the highest likely tsunami will be. And the first thing I will say is, if it's an asteroid, we can't protect you from that. So if an asteroid hits in the Pacific, all bets are off. We've got other problems anyway, right? If it's an asteroid. But we're going to focus on the much more likely kinds of tsunamis that we could experience. By far and away, the most common source is earthquakes. The largest earthquake source is the Cascadia earthquake source, magnitude 9 earthquake, very much like what happened in Japan in 2011. Right off our coast, we know where the subduction zone is. There's some debate as to how much slip there will be. We know the length really well. We don't know the width of the rupture as well, but we know that in Humboldt County, much of that rupture is on land, which means we'll have much stronger ground shaking, but our tsunami is not likely to be as big as it will be along the central Oregon and Washington coasts, where the entire rupture is offshore. So we look very closely at the likely sources. We also look at where we could get a big landslide. We also look at tsunamis coming from Japan or Kamchatka or Chile. So that's what the state, folks in the state, and I have to give kudos to Rick Wilson and Jay Patton at the California Geological Survey, who've done lots of work on trying to estimate what the worst case tsunami would be. You look at splays. So if you have Cascadia rupture along with a little salmon fault, you look at if it happens at the highest tide. Turns out tide's important. We were lucky in 2011 that the Japan tsunami arrived at low tide. We were not lucky in 1964 when the tsunami arrived at high tide. It really illustrates the difference in the hazard. So you look at all of those things, you run models, you look at evidence for tsunamis on the peninsula. And to me, that's almost the most convincing. There are two things that convince me the most that we're on the right track. One is if you core in the Mad River Slough, you do not find any tsunami deposits. So if you had a tsunami that was large enough to get over the lowest part of the dunes, which is about 40, 45 feet, we would see sand in the Mad River Slough. We don't see any sand in the Mad River Slough for at least the last 3,000 years. Second, if you look at the age of the sand deposits in the dunes. And it's real easy to do. If you are at the Manila Community Center, just grab a little baggie and put some of the sand on the top of the dune in that baggie, then drive down to the site of the Milwaukee and go on to the highest dune there, pour out your high dune sand, and you'll see that it's yellow compared to the gray sands at the Milwaukee site. You're looking at the difference in age. You're looking at an area which has been repeatedly overswept by large waves, and hence everything is gray and relatively young compared to those high dunes where it takes thousands of years to get that much yellow around the sand. So I'm perfectly comfortable going to those high dunes. And it's really nice to have a grab and go kit with some things in it, because I might be stuck up there for a day or two or three. But that's really sort of process of estimating the hazard on the peninsula.
Okay, there's a question. I'm interested in more about the freshwater fault. Any references to that? I may have spotted it at the end of Redmond Road, question mark.
Okay, I'm going to actually refer you to somebody who knows a whole lot more about all these faults, Mark Hempel Haley, who is still teaching at Humboldt. All you have to do is send Mark an email or contact the geology department, and he will give you a much more expert assessment of specific faults. And I should have thanked Mark on my list of thank yous.
And final question, what size tsunami created auric tsunami sands?
Auric tsunami sands? I'm not completely unaware of what auric tsunami sands are. What you see, I mean, there's a lot of sand around auric, but we actually don't have any evidence, direct evidence of a peak height in auric from sands. What we do have is 3 UROC accounts of what was probably the last tsunami. And those are really what we use for the peak tsunami estimate near auric, which is 55, 56 feet above mean sea level. And those are from UROC accounts.
Are there any other questions? Have we exhausted you, Lori? I want to thank everybody for attending today. You've been wonderful. There are a ton of questions. You have incredible endurance. I mean, 72 or 3 of you survived all the way to the end of her presentation, and there's still 65 people here, and I'm pretty amazed because that's pretty unique. So thank you ever so much. And you'll have to let us know what you want to talk about next, starting February, okay? Because we have the first 2 in January. We are, by the way, going to have no regular winter sessions, but we are going to have brown bag talks starting on January 23rd and running all the way through the spring.
Oh, good.
So just to let you know, there are going to be lots of opportunities. And Lori will have another opportunity to do another fabulous presentation like this one.
Well, maybe it will be a good chance to talk about a non-earthquake generated tsunami that we knew nothing about prior to January 15th of this year.
Oh my goodness, that sounds intriguing.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. And if you're still here, I have one announcement to make for this upcoming Wednesday, September 21st at 3 p.m. at the Humboldt or Cal Poly Humboldt Library. There is a ribbon cutting ceremony. I will post a link in the chat if you are interested. There's going to be refreshments. There's going to be different activities. So yeah, if you're interested in that, come on over to the library, and yeah, it should be a good time.
What time is that again?
It's going to be this Wednesday, September 21st at 3 p.m.
Wonderful. And I forgot to say that next week on Monday, we're going to have this September 26th, a presentation by the Alzheimer's Association about the highlights of the Alzheimer's Association International Conference, which just occurred with Claire Day. You'll get an up and Kim Coelho will get an update on the research being conducted and hear about the highlights of the 2022 Alzheimer's Association International Conference. That should be the latest and greatest about what we know. So that should be very interesting to those of you who are worried about this or who have a relative that has an issue or a friend, etc. So do feel free to join us again. Thanks so much. Have a great day. It's beautiful out. Now go out and play. And thank you, Laurie, as always. You're wonderful.